Hey everyone, welcome back to the Brick City Brown Chick Show. Voice is still not 100%, but we are pressing on. This week, I wanted to talk about the subject of gratitude. Many people, I think, misunderstand what gratitude is or what it's supposed to be. Many people feel like gratitude is you should, spend all your time praising someone or worshiping someone who gave you a break in life or who helped you, and that should always be at the forefront. I look at gratitude more as something you learn to develop over time. In other words, you may not understand what a person contributed to your life at a particular moment in time, but as you get older and as you have more experiences, you understand what that person contributed and you acknowledge their role or their place in how you understand the world. And the example I'm going to use today is from my own life. Those of you who've been with this podcast for several months know that I went to an all-girl Catholic high school in New Jersey. And they're not nearly as popular as they used to be, but in the 50s through the 90s, all girls schools were a big deal, especially high schools. Now, not all of them were Catholic, some were just private schools. But in New Jersey, most of them were Catholic. There were all boys schools too, because the Catholics, the Archdiocese of New Jersey, felt very strongly that when kids got to high school, they needed to be separated. Boys needed to be here, girls needed to be there. Now, part of that was about sexuality, not wanting to encourage teenagers to get together. But another part of that was really about the educational experience. I have heard many stories since I left high school and became an adult about girls who struggled through college because during high school they were all but ignored. Teachers would pay more attention to the boys, mostly because the boys misbehaved or the boys were out of hand. So they had to spend more time focusing on the boys and didn't focus as much on the girls. So when those girls went to college, they were timid and afraid to answer questions or to show off their intelligence. I was never one of those girls. I knew what I knew and I knew what I didn't know. But I was never afraid in any class I had in college, if I knew the answer, to raise my hand and give it. I had no qualms about that whatsoever. And I credit a lot of that to the fact that I went to an all girls school and therefore I was never intimidated. Now, having gone to an all girl Catholic high school meant that the school was run by nuns. And in my particular case, the high school I went to was run by the Sisters of Charity. Now, without going into a long explanation about Catholicism itself, just understand that different groups of nuns, which are called orders, different orders of nuns have different missions. So you can have an order of nun that are cloistered, meaning they never leave the convent. Their whole focus is on prayer and sacrifice. And then you have orders of nuns that are teaching nuns. They are called to be out in the community and teach because that is the mission of their order. The Sisters of Charity were teaching nuns. They taught grade school, they taught high school, some of them taught college. That is the goal of their order, is to teach the next generation. So the nuns at our school were intensely serious. They were all about academics. They wanted us to be strong Christian women. So that is what they were focused on. It was very rare back then for a nun from a different order to come teach in a school run by different nuns. That was a very rare occurrence. But in my sophomore year of high school, we had just such an occurrence. A nun who was a sister of St. John's joined our school to teach religion, of all things. Her name was Sister Thomas Moore. Now, another thing about nuns, without getting into a whole lot of detail, is back in the day, and by that I mean prior to the 1960s, the Catholic Church required nuns to take male saints' names. And that goes back to the patriarchy and men being in charge and all that kind of thing. So when a woman pledged herself to an order and became a nun, she was required to take on a new name, to take on a Catholic name. And before the 1970s, nuns were required to take male saints' names. Now, understand that for most nuns, there was a difference between their legal name, the name they were born with, and their order name. So on official documents, they would use their birth name, but on church documents, they would use their order name. So those were two different things, the birth name and their order name. In Sister Thomas Moore's case, she had become a nun in the 1950s, probably, maybe even the 1940s. She made the decision to officially change her birth name from whatever it was before, because she would never tell anyone, to Sister Thomas Moore. So when she went to college, for example, as a nun, the first day of class, the professor would always say Thomas Moore Sr., because that's how they read it. And she would always have to clarify and say, my name is Sister Thomas Moore. And so that was very confounding that she, as a woman, would change her name to officially to a man's name. But that was just the beginning of how Sister Thomas Moore was different than the other nuns we knew. She lived with her order on Long Island, New York. And if you're not familiar with like New York, New Jersey geography, New Jersey is here, and then you've got New York City, and then at the very end of New York City is Long Island. It's way out. So she probably drove 2.5 hours one way to our school every day to teach us. And then she would drive the 2.5 hours back to her order on Long Island. So that was fascinating about her, because the Sisters of Charity, the nuns who ran our school, lived on the property of the school. So they literally had to walk next door, where she hopped in her car and would drive back to her order. She was an ace mechanic. Her car was, of course, not a new car, not a recent car, because she would have had to purchase it herself. But there were days when her car would stop running and she would get under the hood with her tools and do whatever she did, and she'd get that car up and running again. So she was an absolute maverick, amazing woman that made all of us, all the girls who went to that school, rethink what we knew about nuns. Now, as a teacher of theology, we all had the expectation that Sister Thomas, as we called her, was going to tell us the same thing that all the other nuns had told us for most of our lives. I went to Catholic grade school as well, so by the time Sister Thomas was my teacher, I was 10 years into Catholic indoctrination about the world and the Bible and religion and what women did and what men did and all that sort of thing. And that was not Sister Thomas's approach. She was really out on a limb, sort of by herself, in terms of making us rethink the way we thought about religion. And so what she started with was the first book of the Bible, which is Genesis, part of which tells the story of Adam and Eve. Now, if you know the story of Adam and Eve, God cast Adam and Eve out of heaven because they ate fruit from this forbidden tree that he had told them not to eat from. Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel fought each other, and Cain killed Abel. So that's the beginning story of humanity that's told in the Bible. And so we were having this discussion one day, and one of my classmates raised their hand and said, "Sister, do you believe the Genesis story as it's written?" And she looked at us perplexed for a minute and then said, "Of course not." And we were like, "Of course not. We've all been told our whole lives that, this is what happened. This is the reality." And she said, "Okay, girls, in this class, I'm going to really need you to think. I'm really going to need you to put pieces together and not think about this in the way that they taught you as children, but think about it as the maturing adults you're becoming. Let's say we believe Genesis is actually the story of humanity. If humanity started with Adam and Eve, a man and a woman, and they had two sons, Cain and Abel, and one son killed the other son, how does humanity continue to procreate? It would mean that Eve, the mother, would have had to marry Cain, the son, or at least procreate with him because there were no other women. Do you really think that's how humanity started? Or do you really want to think that's how humanity started? And we were all dumbfounded because, of course, it had never occurred to any of us that if you play through that story, that's what would have had to happen. And so that sparked our curiosity. And we said, "Okay, sister, if you're telling us that Genesis did not occur the way the Bible says it occurs, then what happened?" And she said, "Girls, the point is not what actually happened. The point is that the Bible is not a history book. You cannot read the Bible as if this is the way things happen, because the Bible was not written in real time. The Bible was written hundreds and in some cases thousands of years later by the descendants of the people who began humanity to explain where they came from. It's an explanation. It's a version. It's not fact. It's not history. Mind-blowing. For 15-year-old me, that was a mind-blowing possibility because, of course, we'd all been raised in Catholicism. We'd all been raised in faith. And faith meant that you took all the books of faith literally. And here was this woman who, by the way, had a PhD in both theology and environmental science. So she had religion and science. Here she was telling a classroom full of girls who had spent their entire lives believing that the Bible was fact and there was no questioning it. Here she was telling us that was incorrect. That was the wrong way to think about it. And that we really needed to use our common sense and our higher level intellect to question everything we were taught. And that was God's intention. God put us on top of the pecking order because we had the ability to discern fact and fiction and faith, and that they all didn't necessarily go together. And ever since that course, I have questioned practically everything. Anyone who knows me or has known me for longer than 10 minutes knows that I've been called all sorts of things. Negative Nancy, Downer Dora, you name it. Because whatever someone says, if we're working on a project or whatever, I'm always the person who says, but what about, or have you thought about, or are we going to talk about? I've always been that person. And I am forever grateful to Sister Thomas for her perspective and for her ability to be both a woman of science and a woman of faith. In 2025, we are at a crossroads in terms of the entire world. Are we going to go to war with this country, that country, the other country? Do we believe climate change is real? Do we believe watching the polar ice caps melt and watching temperatures go higher and higher? Do we believe that's real? Or do we believe the deniers who say, it's just what happens? What I want people to take away from this episode is questioning anything is your God provided right as a human being. It is your obligation to understand the difference between facts and fiction, between science and faith. And that does not mean you are not a person of faith because you question what you are told about faith and about God. That you can be a serious, devout, faithful servant and also question what you are told. So I encourage everyone to ask questions. If it's something you don't understand or doesn't make any sense, or you just don't believe it, question it. That's your responsibility. Sister Thomas, when we had her as a teacher, was probably well into her 60s. And that was 30 plus years ago. So I am quite sure she has gone on to her heavenly rest. But I want to thank her for giving me the strength and the courage and the ability to always question when something is not plain and not factual. I've always had the ability to question, and I thank her forever for that. And I thank you for joining me this week for this episode of the Brick City Brown Chick Show. If you are not subscribed, please do so. There's a button probably directly underneath me where you can subscribe, and that way you'll be notified every week when I put up new episodes. Thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.